Hello, and welcome to Season 1, Episode 8 of the Oxford Wine and Spirit podcast. My name's Tom Brady, and I'll be your host for today. As you can see, I'm coming to you live from the shop on Tell Street. It's been a long day, and I'm waiting for another customer to walk in at any moment. Now, with our sideshow, Open a Bottle, and our fascinating episode on sake last week, I felt it was about time we came back and did a wine episode. I've just gone and looked at when my guest, Isobel Salamon, and I recorded this episode originally. And rather shamefully, I realized it was way back in June 2023. Isobel, I'm so sorry it's taken me so long to release this one. I've been busy. I apologize. I've just had a chance to listen back to the episode, and I really enjoyed it. We're talking all about Piemonte and Langhe and the incredible wines from this region. Isobel can talk about this subject far better than I can. So I suppose it's about time we got this thing rolling. And I really hope you enjoy what we had to say. Cheers. Isobel, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about this one. But before we dive into all things Piemonte related, I'd love to take a little step back and talk about you. You've got a CV that I'm really rather jealous of. Let's talk a little bit about that to start with, particularly with your current role as founder and director of Slonk Consultancy. Over to you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Tom, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. We're talking about my absolute passion region, the Langhe, so that is very exciting to me. So yeah, my name is Isobel Salamon. I run an international wine consultancy business called Slonk. So basically what I do is I work in a couple of different countries, particularly Scotland, where I'm based at the moment. Also do some work in Australia and do quite a bit of work in both Spain and Italy. Primarily in the UK, I do a lot of work building teams, overseeing wine, sort of directing activities, drinks programs in general. So I work with theatres, hotels, restaurants of all different sizes, which is really fun and keeps me entertained because I love data. So that's a really fun element for me. And then I do a lot of work providing brand consultancy, so copywriting, introduction to new markets for different producers across the world. And so this is when we're talking about reinventing little labels and getting people to be a bit more competitive in the modern market as we see it today. I do event and education, wine buying and writing, and then I also do a little bit of importing, which at the moment is my absolute bane of my existence because getting through all of the logistics of doing so is very annoying. So I have a lot of stuff in London City Bond that I just need to be able to actually move. So yes, and then I have, while I consider myself a generalist, I do have a few key focus areas that I have been developing on. So to start with, I'll say I do a lot of work in Spain. So typically some of my areas there are Rioja, Jerez, so with sherry, and then also with Brias Baixas. And I kind of love doing work in those regions because I find it a really fascinating up and coming area, and Cava as well. I do a bit with champagne and aromatized wines, and then obviously Australian wines, and now the Langhe, which is where I am an ambassador and really proud to be one of the 15 global advanced ambassadors in the world. And so I'll be overseeing different works to do with activities in both mainly Scotland and Australia, which is very fun for me because I'm really wanting to create a big Barolo dinner at some point in Melbourne where there's sort of an institution for Italian culture.
Well, hopefully I can come to one of these big dinners. That sounds very exciting. And absolutely, this is a topic that I am extremely excited to talk about. It's a region that makes some of the best wines I think I've probably ever tried in my life. So let's crack on and talk about it a little bit. I think before we delve into history and technique and climate, I think this region, probably more so than many others in the world, is one where there's so much confusion in terms of the geographical terminology. So I'd like to start by talking about that, probably as well because we'll throw around a couple of terms today, and it's good to kind of get off on the right foot before we move into some slightly more romantic topics. But do you think you could start just by outlining for us where in the world we're talking about and how it all breaks down, i.e. Piemonte, Langhe, Barolo, etc., etc.?
Yeah, so I think as we've touched on before, it is such a bizarre region in terms of geography. So one thing that I always find very, very entertaining is I was so bad at geography at school. So it was probably my absolute worst subject. I couldn't read a map. I've since discovered that that's something to do with my dyslexia. But anyway, I was really, really shocking at reading back maps and being able to understand things. So wine has really grounded my sense of understanding of the world. So I now absolutely love talking about it. But I thought what would be helpful is if I bring out an actual map to show you where we are. So I've got my big wine atlas here, which is sort of very helpful. So when we are talking about Piedmont, we are talking about the top of Italy. So you've got Italy, which I like to think breaks down into north and south. So Piedmont is in the north. So we are looking at the northwest. So it is its nearest major city is Turin, which is sort of what is helpful to think of. So it's 50 kilometers from Turin, about an hour's drive or about an hour and a half train into Alba. We are bordering with France and Switzerland. So this is when it is very important when we're thinking of the Alpine influence, because there's a lot of Alps, and that is really beneficial when we are looking at grape growing, because we get these cooling Alpine winds trickling down from the Swiss Alps because they're right next door, and also for the Tanaro River, which is possibly the major part of the Langhe because it runs all the way down from the Alps and all the way through Piemonte. So what is really important here is that the Alpine reserves, they replenish the Tanaro usually. So with climate change, this becomes quite an issue when we're looking at, well, how are the grapes actually feeding into that river more? So we've got the Alps and the Apennines, and they're our major mountain ranges nearby. And then we have Turin nearby, and then we keep trickling downwards. We have three parts of Piemonte. So we have the Alta Langhe, which is up and it reaches 900 meters up. So this is a mountain range there. It's known for its very famous hazelnuts. That's sort of what it's known for. They get real elegance there, and sparkling wine. And it's a really cool up and coming region now because as climate is moving into being warmer, people are moving upwards. And here they're making more traditional method sparklings as well. So you're getting more of those like 36 months on lees, really like big, more champagne style. Then we have the Bassalanga, which when you think of it, it's sort of the base. And this is in the province of Alba. So that is the very, very famous little town that you can catch the train into. Absolutely beautiful. Everyone should visit it at some point in time. Really fun little bars, amazing food, and also wine country right on your doorstep. So they're famous for their truffles and for the wine production. And that has the province of Alba and its surroundings. So this is where sort of the 9 appellations lie, or the main sort of 9 appellations that are protected by the Consorzio. When I speak of appellations, because I think this is very confusing before, we jump into anything else, appellations mean like your Barbaresco, DOCG, your Barolo, DOCG, your Dogliani, DOCG, your Barbera di Alba, DOC. So we're talking, these are the specific titles that people call appellations. So not really that necessary for from the perspective of a consumer, aside from the fact that you want to know what's on your label, and that is defined by how it's made, where it's grown, and where it is situated within Alba, so the Bassalanga. And then we have the Langhe Astigiani. Sorry, my pronunciation of that was terrible. Astigiana. My Italian teacher would be horrified. So this is the province of Asti. So when you look on a map, you'll often see Asti, Alba, they'll crop up in sort of the Piedmont region. You can catch the train to Asti as well. Asti is very famous for Moscato di Asti, so they created Moscato di Asti there, and the method, which is all about stopping the fermentation before it finishes so that you still have these lovely sweet like juices in there. A lot of people consider this just a nice afternoon wine, or if you're in France, this is what you'll have as an aperitif with a nice slice of cheese. Some people will have it for breakfast. I've discovered that Hong Kong has become obsessed with making this into cocktails with a slice of rock melon and topped up with soda. So anyway, it is a nice sweet wine. That comes from there. You also get beautiful Arnaise there, which is a really nice white wine, very pretty, very floral, really elegant. You'll also get things like Barbera di Asti, which is very different from Barbera di Alba, because again, it's in one of the 3 parts of the Langhe. So that is the main part. So Alba is southeast of the Tanaro. Asti is northwest. So the Tanaro, again, is running all the way down from the Alps, and it's basically separating. So similar to when we're thinking in Bordeaux, your left bank, your right bank, we're in the same kind of thing. It's just northwest versus east-south. So that's that. Since 2014, it's been listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So if you go there, you'll notice that it's an incredibly beautiful region. This also comes with its own limitations on what you can do there, but it's absolutely fascinating. But I need to say a few things about the geography. So Langhe in itself means tongues. So this is referring to the three steep-sided hills that run parallel to one another. So they're like tongues of the land feeding into each other. And so they have these deep, narrow valleys that separate them. Langhe also means long hill, and that kind of defines exactly where you are. It is rolling hills. They are steep, they are everywhere. There is very, very little flat land, and there are rules in each of the different appellations on where you can grow, how you can grow things, but also to do with aspects as well. So Barolo, since 2010, now can only be planted on sort of steep, particularly south-facing slopes. So it's very important for what aspect you're on as well. But yes, we're talking big rolling hills, and we're talking river influence as well. So that's two of the main things that you're looking at when you're looking at Piedmont.
Fantastic. And then the hills have a big impact on sort of fog buildup and that sort of thing as well, right?
Yeah, so the flagship grape of the whole area is Nebbiolo. And that's quite interesting because the Nebbiolo name derives from nebbia, which or in the Piemontese dialect, which means fog. And this is all to do with how the winds move around the rolling hills. Basically, in October, which was when it was the harvest traditionally, you'd get these incredibly immersive like fogs that would just cover the hills completely, and they'd cover all the bunches, and it's very, very atmospheric and very beautiful. Also relevant then for making the wine, but this was typically in that time. So yeah, nebbia derives its name from that because it was this foggy grape that was being immersed at these particular times of year. And it's very beautiful to go at that time. Also quite famous around that time for the truffles, because the truffles really do well in that foggy sort of humidity that's brought in.
Oh my gosh, getting hungry already. We'll talk about food a little bit later on, I guess.
I crack open a Nebbiolo last night that you could taste the white truffle in, and because that's what it's very famous for. So you can't talk about Nebbiolo and you can't talk about the Langhe without also talking about the white truffle and the hazelnut as well. They're all such iconic parts of these lands, and they do affect the way that the wine tastes.
And this is a region that's steeped in so much history, right? I feel it's really important to talk about that because it has such an impact on the wine culture as it is today.
Yeah, it's got the coolest history. What I like to think of with this is it's considered the wine of kings. And basically, I'm jumping ahead, but that is because the kings took favour to this and they started to love it. And so it started to become in production. So then it was made for this particular king, King Carlo Alberto of Savoy, and so the wines all started being built around him. He started planting vineyards, and then that became the wine of the kings. But if we jump back to how traditionally wine was cultivated in this particular region, it was actually fizzy and it was sweet. And this is how they were drinking it well up into the mid-19th century. And the whole reason behind why this changed was because it couldn't be, well, somebody ordered it from England, it couldn't be transported safely, and it was completely ruined. So then they looked into, well, how can we make things safe for transport? And so similar to cheese, if you're looking at how to make something safe and has the longevity to actually travel far, you want it to be dry. You don't want any residual sweetness in there because that can just cause funkiness, fermentations in a weird, unstable way, and it can become rancid, which is not what anybody wants. So I like this quote from Thomas Jefferson, where he describes back in 1787, when he particularly loved the wine. He ordered a case of it, got it shipped over to him, which must have taken forever in that period of time because it would have had to come over on some huge boat. But he said, Nebbiolo is as sweet as the silky Madeira, as astringent on the palate as Bordeaux, and as brisk as champagne. It is a pleasing wine. So that kind of shows you sweet, fizzy, different. People liked it, and they had a real appetite for that at the time as well. So then in 1832, Camillo Benso, who's this very, very famous Count of Cavour, if you go to the region, there's big pictures of him everywhere. People adore him. I think he kind of looks like Bilbo Baggins. Yeah, he kind of looks a little like Bilbo Baggins. Anyway, so he was the Count of Cavour, and with the help of a French winemaker, Louis Oudin, he started fermenting his Barolo wines so that they became dry. So he was sort of the pioneer of this dry style. And then he worked with Pier Francesco Staglione, who pioneered the use of closed fermentation tanks, making Barolo less susceptible to the flaws of oxidation. So it reduced that volatile acidity that Nebbiolo tends to be a bit prone to, and oxidation, because Nebbiolo is very, very sensitive to oxidation, which is why we need to be really careful with how we're actually using it in winemaking techniques. So then by 1845, this had become so successful that documents at Rinzani Castle reference the Staglione method, which is quite cool. So that's when we've got these dry wines, we've got them stable, they're very tannic. What they're known for is this like very rose, very tart, very tannic, big wines. And this is around the time when it started to become a favorite amongst the kings, which I find quite interesting because I would love to try these wines. They were very young, but obviously they're very tannic. And we all know how tannic Barolo can be today. So I imagine these were very, very big. But anyway, the kings loved them despite having previously loved, their fizzy red wines. So it seems like a big leap to me to go from something that's a little bit fizzy to something very dry and big and tannic. But this is when King Carlo Alberto of Savoy, so he took favour, he really liked it, hence it became the wine of the kings. And so in his vineyards near his castle in Verduno, which is a famous little town in the area, he started planting vineyards, getting to work building this consultancy project at the Palenzo Royal Estate. And this is where he sort of created this modern farm for experiments. So when you look at the region in itself, it's sort of a double-hand tell in that it's got huge nobility and aristocracy, and then it has so much to do with the farming and so much to do with the land. So it's this massive like two-camp process, and it seems like they just develop like constant battles the whole way through, like different battles in different areas. So in this particular way, he created this modern farm. They were doing all these amazing experiments there, and they were starting to build this sort of cooperative network as well. By 1845, the Genoa-Torino Railway opened up, and this was invaluable for the region. So this meant that all of a sudden we could have that sort of negociant mentality from France, where you're actually exporting wine to different parts of the world. So we started to get this amazing trade because people were experiencing this wine that they loved, that was being made very, very well, and had this really interesting rose tar sort of unique flavor profile, particularly in comparison to, say, the French, who were drinking very different, equally lovely styles, but very, very different. This has such a unique flavor profile. And so Nebbiolo was sort of the prize grape, and then there was Dolcetto that was on the rise. I mean, that's a very, very famous grape, and that, to be honest, is the grape of the region. And that was being used for like your taxes. So paying your taxes, you'd pay with Dolcetto as opposed to paying with actual money. So I really like that. And then, that would be what the farmers were drinking whilst they're actually tending to the vines in the morning. So it has this really lovely, like warm sort of reception. People love Dolcetto. It was the wine of the people, and then Barolo was the wine of exporting and the wine of the kings, kind of. So anyway, so we'd opened up this network, and then we had other parts of the nobility who were coming in. So you've got the Marquise of Barolo. So this was Tancredi Faliati and Juliette Colbert, and they owned most of the land then in the Barolo DOCG zone, using Nebbiolo under the new methods, and they were selling it as Barolo. So this was in the 1840s and the 50s. So we're talking way, way back. It's a very, very old winemaking tradition. And so that was happening in Barolo DOCG. And then my other absolute favorite part, before I move past these like kings and the history and all of this weird part of the 1800s, is Vittorio Emanuele. So he bought this famous Fontana Fredda estate in Serralunga di Alba, which is a very famous village in the Barolo area. And he did this to woo his second wife. So she wasn't really, knowing whether she'd want to be with him. He ended up wooing her by buying her this beautiful vineyard. And if you've heard of the grape Favorita, or the wine style Favorita, which is a famous wine style from the Langhe, it's a white wine style. It's made from Vermentino grapes. So unlike, say, Arnese, which is named after Arnese, or Moscato, which is named after Moscato the grape, which is quite different for a European region. But Favorita is named Favorita because it was this particular queen's favorite wine. So he planted it for her, he made it, he brought it in here, and he called it the Favorita because it's the Favorita of the queen. And I quite like that story. So that was her favorite. And then we had, during this period, aside from that, we had a lot of small sort of entrepreneurs, so a lot of farmers who were there. What we were seeing in the region was, it was a lot of blending. So when we're looking into old traditional sort of other regions, like in France, there was a lot of blending between different parcels. So farmers were growing grapes, then they were finding the best ones, depending on how much money you had, blending them together and making your house Barolo style. This has largely changed since then, but that was what was happening back in the 1800s. And so there was a lot of farmers who were, very proud, making a minimal wage, but they were making a wage. So that's sort of why they were able to have their farms at the particular time. So rules started to need to be being put in place by sort of like the late 1800s, early 1900s. And by 1934, then the Consorzio was founded. So this was overseeing all the winemaking. We obviously then had the war, and that created a huge amount of issues. So a lot of people lost their ability to make any ends meet. There was a lot of rationing. But what you'll see about the people of the Langhe are they are incredibly proud and traditional. And people have kept their farms. So unlike a lot of other regions, particularly in Italy, where sort of people have come in and bought farms, there are so many family-owned run places in Barolo that have just been handed down from generation to generation, barely making money for an awfully long time. But now, after you get a couple of generations doing so, then you're able to tick that over and start to make a bit more money. So in 1966, we had Barolo and Barbaresco identified, and then we can move on to modern history, because by the 70s, everything started to change. So up until this point, we had very big structured wines. So this is what was wanted. We had wines that were suitable for very long aging, very dry, aged with long macerations to get those big tannins being brought into it. Nebbiolo itself is a very finicky grape. I like to describe it as my husband because I think it's very precious. And I think that, I feel like it's a very, very finicky grape. It doesn't like being told what to do, and it's very temperamental. So it adapts incredibly well. It has a propensity for adapting to both winemaker and environment, but it is incredibly precious. Also isn't great with maintaining color. So with those prolonged macerations, you can maintain more of that extraction of color. So anyway, they were doing that, and they'd create these big, really robust wines that were very suitable for aging. You needed to have food alongside them, and they were aged in these big old Slovenian oak barrels, which meant that they weren't really getting any of the characteristics of the wood. They were more just to showcase the characteristics of the Nebbiolo. By the 70s, there started to be a bit more of a wave of people starting to rebel a little bit against this. And then we started seeing people doing a bit more, like moving in to have new French oak barrels, shorter maceration, starting to try and create a bit more softness in there. So we were seeing this from the 70s and the 80s, and we were starting to see this stylistic tug of war in a way between like these modernists and traditionalists. And this all sort of erupted by 1993 with the Barolo Wars, which, if you've heard of it, it was when the Barolo boys, they rolled into town. And when we're talking about the Barolo boys, we're talking about, these are very, very famous producers. They're half of them. So we're talking about Renato Ratti. We're talking about Vietti. We're talking about Roberto Varezio. And in this movement, they said, look, we want to create something that is commercially savvy, actually has a market outside of where we are. We want something that's softer. People can drink this. They don't need to wait like 40 years before they can drink their wine and enjoy it. Let's make something that's, we're not going crazy. Let's make something that's ready for 10 years as opposed to this. So they were looking at more greener harvest and green pruning. So they were trying to pick a bit earlier, shorter maceration, so they weren't bringing as many of these tannins into the wine. They were looking at, soft, smaller French oak barrels to impart a bit more of those vanilla, a bit more of those softer flavors. And it was considered the traditionalists in one camp, the modernists in another camp. And this became very, very intense because it was the case of, who was it? Elio Alteri, who, again, he was kind of like the leader of the movement. He went into his father, who was a very traditionalist and a very famous producer. He went into his cellar and just got a chainsaw and started hacking up like his old, like big Slovenian oak barrels, which are very expensive. So this was a lot of damage. I mean, I don't know if I agree with this sort of practice. I don't think you should just start going and destroying, do something on your own. But he was completely disinherited, and he was never brought back into the family after that. So it was a trying time, but it did mean that we had these two different wine styles, and it was hard to distinguish outside of knowing who was a modernist and who was a traditionalist, which wine you were getting, because there wasn't a huge amount of information outside of the media saying these are a couple of names who are doing a modern approach, and these are some that are doing a traditional approach. But obviously there were others there, and so it would kind of be more of a gamble as what you were getting in the bottle, depending on style. As we've moved on in time, things are changing further, especially with sort of like warming temperatures. So we have to be very aware of like global warming and how things are changing. And what this means is largely a lot of the practices of the modernists are now being adopted. We've got better techniques in the vineyards. We've got better hygiene in the winemaking areas and actually in the places for our viniculture. And we have a lot more use of smaller barrels, a lot more use of different fermentations, shorter macerations are happening, less extractions are happening. So we are largely seeing across the board more modern practices happening. But yeah, it's just quite funny because this caused such a feud, and now this is sort of the way of the future anyway. But yeah, so that's pretty much a good sum of the history.
The Barolo was such a fascinating piece of history, and it's something that people still talk about to this day. How do you think all of these things have impacted the culture of Barolo today? Because you still can find bottles which are made in a very traditionalist way, and then bottles that are made in a much more modern style. Is there more communication? Is it easier for the consumer to sort of pick between the two?
I think it's easier in the sense that now there is more similarity in styles, but I think that there is so much needing to be done on this because I think there's a lot of confusion. I even find it confusing. So I feel now I'm pretty knowledgeable in the region. I find it can be confusing if you don't know what you're looking for. So I think one thing that really, really helps is as of 2010, they created sort of this MGA system, which is basically just a geographical unit of land. And so it is kind of like the Premier Cru system in Burgundy. And what this does is it identifies for Barolo 170 different MGAs. So you've got 170 different ones. You can name them. This tells you if it's a wine being produced from that region. You can only name that sort of parcel on the label. If you're making it there, you're growing the grapes from there, and you can add in a certain amount from one other MGA, but it's a very small amount. And it means that you're getting somewhere where you know more about the soils, you know more about the weather, you know more about what people are doing in that region. So I think that offers the best insight, but I think that is one thing that the consortio will need to be moving forward and actually getting more out there to people, because starting to educate people like me on it is great, but we also need to be able to then translate that to the consumer because, yeah, it's very confusing. And I think the fact that a lot of people heard about the Barolo Wars but may not have, got one of the bottles that was showing those softer sides. So if somebody brought it misunderstanding what they were buying or who they were buying from, because again, it's Italy, a lot of the names are quite similar. Like we've got Vieto and Vietti, they're both quite famous producers. So, it's just like there's often like one label and you may have picked up the wrong bottle. Somebody may have brought it, told them a story, and then you think, oh, well, that's not what I like at all. So I do think it's a matter of, we need more communication. We need to be talking about more particularities and how we can get the flavors that we want. And I think that comes down to people like yourselves in wine shops as well, putting out, this is the lighter style, more modern, more fun. This one is more age-worthy.
It wouldn't be the wine industry if it wasn't shocking at communicating what's actually in the bottles. So, it's true to form at least on that front. And dream scenario here, if you were to do a tasting and you wanted to compare one bottle from one camp to another bottle from another camp, in your mind, which two bottles are you going to go for?
Ooh, one of the best examples I can think is if you can find, and you'll see this on the label, so you'll see like the town that it's from. So as I was saying, there's 170 MGAs, and then there are 11 communal villages. There's 5 main ones that we see all the time. So that's sort of like your Serralunga di Alba, your Barolo, your La Mora, your Castiglionifaletti, Filetti. So there's 5 major ones. So you see those, but then there's also the 11. So I feel like they're the best source because depending on where they are on the map, you can get very different flavors in them. So my favorite thing to do is compare Barolo from La Mora to Serralunga di Alba because La Mora is a little bit lighter. It has younger soils. It's still big, but it's more lighter and more fresher. So if people don't like as much tannin, that's such a good example of how it's different compared to Serralunga. And it's sort of like as you trickle downwards towards Serralunga, which is in the bottom part of the Barolo sort of big appellation, then you are finding they get a bit more of that strong tar, big, bold, as opposed to if you keep going up, they get a little bit lighter. I really like wines from Rodi, which is like a smaller sort of town, and I think they're absolutely lovely. Verduno is also near the top, so it's a little bit cooler there. It produces really elegant, lighter styles. So yeah, it's just about finding those pockets that you know. A great example is literally get one from each of the towns if you can. I'd start with the 5 major ones. If you can then get one from each of the 11, most of them will be pretty typical. You'll at least get a typical profile of what the region looks like. And then you can start to learn, oh, these are the flavors I like. These are not the flavors that I like.
I think something that a lot of consumers struggle with in the actually when should we be drinking this stuff as well. There's a couple of times recently where we've opened up bottles from, we're sitting in 2023, we've opened bottles from 2018, and there's a lot of great things about those wines. But in terms of the price of the bottle, it doesn't seem worth it. But then maybe we're just opening them far too early. Maybe we should be laying them down for a little bit longer. I mean, what's your impression of this? And how should we as consumers go about storing these wines? When should we buy them? What should we do with them? When should we open them?
Yeah. So this is a question for, well, one, I think as a rule of thumb, Barolo, leave it for 10 years. Just leave it. It will do you well. Leave it for 10 years, decant it for 2 before, like I like to decant Barolos at least 2 hours before I'm going to drink it. Most people will say 1. Honestly, if you go up to 4 for these big sort of like Serralunga ones, that will really, really benefit it. Like a nice decanting of it is wonderful. But yeah, anywhere from the higher parts, so your Verduno, your Lamora, those ones are, you can have a little bit sooner. And then anywhere further down, you're wanting, and more in that sort of inland, sort of like your Monteforte de Albas, your Serralunga, you're wanting to keep those for at least 10 years. And when we're keeping them, we're wanting to keep them in a cool sort of like moderate temperature that we can maintain all year round. We want no vibrations nearby, and we want to just lay that down on its side so it can stay near its cork, keeping nice and, controlled in the bottle. But it will do you well. Like they should be laid down for a little bit. Obviously, if they're more modern in style, so if you start to know some of the more modern producers, like your Ratti, like your Vietti, you can start to think, oh, well, those ones I can probably open a bit earlier because they're not going to have as much of that like slap in your face tannic profile, whereas some of the other ones will obviously have that. In saying that, different methods that are happening at the moment mean that we can open them a bit earlier. So that's one of the best things about climate change for this region. It means that previously when you're like talking 10 to 20 years, and again, depending on how you want it to drink, I think if you open it within 8 years, decant it in the right way and have it with a proper meal, because Barolo, you're not meant to be just drinking by itself. No one's like, here's a nice afternoon wine, let's have a glass of Barolo. That's not the wine for that setting. Plenty of others in the Langhe you should have. Barolo is not that one. So yeah, lay those down for a while. If it's more modern and it's had like some shorter maceration, so if you can read online that's saying it's done a bit more of shorter macerations, it's a bit more accessible, it's more silkier tannins. If those notes are in the descriptions, then yeah, those ones can be drunk a bit younger. If it's saying very thick, chewy tannins, if we're talking robust tannins, we're talking big, if you see the word outstanding longevity, that one wants to be aged for a while. So little buzzwords that come out like during the different points. And obviously people collect these wines, so they are staples and they will reward you down the line, particularly if you store it well. They'll be worth a lot like down the line, but for your enjoyment's sake, 8 years minimum. That's kind of what I think of as a rule of thumb for Barolo. Barbaresco, little different. So Barbaresco is what I think is one of my, it's my favorite appellation, to be honest. I adore Barbarescos, particularly ones of people like Angelo Gaia, who was also a Barolo boy. Like they have such beautiful finesse on them. So they are, if Barolo's the king, Barbaresco is the beautiful, elegant queen. And let's say they're the gender neutral of each. It's just more like The king's very like intense and like feisty, probably has gout. The queen's a bit more elegant, has a bit of finesse. So these ones, you get this beautiful like wild geranium quality that comes through it. And they have like this really nice proximity to the Tanaro River. So the Tanaro is really important for Barbaresco just because it gets its water reserves from there. And they're on, they get really nice cooling breezes. So they're just more elegant and they're softer. Those ones are more drinkable. So Barbaresco, which for some reason I never understand why people don't drink more Barbaresco. It is so difficult. It's so old already. Like we're talking like 5 years before it comes to the market. So we're already at a stage where it's been made for a while, which is important for people to know. So Barolo 6 years, Barbaresco 5 years. So these are your different times before you can actually drink these wines anyway. But it just is, it's more accessible. It's got softer, silkier tannins. It's very elegant. It's very nice. I think everyone should drink more Barbaresco. And I think it's a bit easier to navigate because there's a bit more, like obviously you have your very high-end producers and lower ones. You still have a lot of tannins because I should say Barolo and Barbaresco, both 100% Nebbiolo. So in some of the different appellations in the Langhe, they're not Nebbiolo, and there are other grapes in the region, but for these two, it's Nebbiolo, and it's made in the same way, but it's just in different exposures on different soils, similar soils, but just there's a bit more sand in Barbaresco, which gives it a bit more finesse and elegance.
I've started drinking a lot of just straight up Langhe Nebbiolo, so not Barbaresco, not Barolo, usually younger stuff, usually from sort of 2019, 2020, and I think it's a really good kind of gateway, particularly if someone's interested in the category but doesn't want to spend £90, £100 plus on a bottle. How are they making these wines differently to your classic Barbarescos and Barolos?
So it's all to do with, and may I say good, because everyone should be drinking more Langhe Nebbiolo. I think it is such an underrated style. I think people quickly jump into your Barolo and your Barbaresco, but more people should be drinking Langhe Nebbiolo. So it's all to do with where it's planted and it's aging as well. These ones are on steep slopes, manual processing. They're not aged for anywhere near as long. They've got east-northeast exposures. So again, they're a little bit cooler. They're not normally getting as much of that like intense sun. They're traditionally on poorer sort of plots. But again, with climate change, we're starting to notice these are actually quite good because previously they weren't getting enough sun and they're getting plenty of sun. So they don't need to actually worry about all these like incredibly heating up the soils and heating up the land and worrying about drought so much. But they do shorter macerations. So it's always shorter macerations with these as opposed to Barolo and Barbaresco. They do much longer ones. So we're getting, with the macerations, what you're getting is tannic extraction. So the good thing about Nebbiolo are there's a lot of extractable tannins. It's just a case of they're very hard to work with. So it takes a long time to actually extract them. But you do less. So you do about 30 days, and that's maximum for Langhe Nebbiolo. Then you bottle it and it's sold 2 years after the harvest. So it's just meant to be a younger style. You're meant to be more drinkable, goes on the table, but it's fresher. Whereas you'll have much longer ones. You're getting more tannic profile from the Barolos and Barbarescos. They are made for aging and they're made for enjoying much later, and they want to really get that flavor profile of the grapes. So obviously, as well as extracting polyphenols, you're extracting all those flavors. So you actually get that with the macerations as well. So you lose that a bit with the younger Nebbiolos, but you do get a really nice flavor. So you get that beautiful like rose note that starts to come through. You get that nice licorice element, and yeah, they'll just make a lot easier wines for the table. One thing I would like more people to also drink is Langhe Niceta, which is a white grape. So this is a grape that almost died out years ago, and then it's starting to be recultivated. So it's an indigenous grape to the area. It makes the most beautiful golden wines, and it's such a unique flavor. You get a bit of oiliness on it, particularly depending on how you play around with it, but it's very like beautifully floral. Like it has these really nice like waxy white flower elements that come through. It's a very cool grape, and it's always in that sort of Langhe area as well. You'll see Langhe Niceta, and it's definitely one I think people should seek out when they can. And it's along the side and the price point of Langhe Nebbiolo as well.
That's not a grape I've tried before. It wouldn't be a discussion on Italian wines if there wasn't a brand new grape that I'd never heard before, because every time I think I've got it sussed, there is another grape to get my teeth into, which is fantastic.
You must. I love showing this to people because it's just a different flavor. You know how whenever you try a new grape, it's just yeah, it just tastes different. And you're like, okay, that's good. Something new to add into my palate.
One that I really loved when I tried a couple of years ago for the first time was Fraser, which I believe is a cousin of Nebbiolo.
Yeah, and actually doing incredibly well because it's a little bit it's hardier, so it's not as finicky as Nebbiolo, and it has similar flavor profiles as well. So it's one of those grapes that is really a talking point for, should we be doing more with this for the future? Because we should be maybe planting some more of this along, because you can't be planting Nebbiolo anymore on new sites. That's a rule as of 2010. And so it's whether, well, maybe we should start planting more Fraser, because that one actually will grow really well, has this similar characteristic, but also we could sell it at maybe a younger sort of level and do it at more of a mass volume, as opposed to, you know, the higher end volume that we could keep for our prize Nebbiolo.
And we discussed, well, you mentioned Dolcetto a little bit earlier, and I think it's probably a good time to come back and talk about Dolcetto. For me, it's the ultimate pizza wine.
Oh yeah, and that's what the winemakers say as well. So my favorite thing was when I went to a few vineyards last year, actually, so early sort of April last year, when it was the massive drought. So it was a trying time for all the winemakers over in the Langhe. But I was in Alba with a producer, and she was telling me about her father used to have, for like before midday, 2 liters of Dolcetto. So as I was touching on before, it was like,
as you do,
farmers would be drinking whilst they were out there picking the vines, and she'd be like, yeah, we just drink our 2 liters of Dolcetto. So yeah, you'll often still find it on like as table wine in that whole region, but it lost favor for some reason, and purely because it's not as long, like it doesn't have as long aging, which I think is nonsense, because we do have 2 appellations, which are sort of Diano di Alba and Dogliani, my absolute favorite appellation of this sort of Dolcetto part, which are making the most structured, beautiful Dolcettos. And it's just got such a fun, like earthy flavor. It's easy, but it's also so flavorsome. So you're getting all these nice different elements in there. It's perfect with pizza. It's perfect with pasta, just basic pasta. And it's just a really good everyday drinking wine. But if you do want more premium ones of these, you should look out for Dogliani, because you'll see that on the label. And these are very structured, very controlled yields. So similar to, so when we were talking about what's the difference between Langhe, Nebbiolo and Barolo and Barbaresco, so also there are very controlled yields for Barolo and Barbaresco, which get even more controlled if it's from an MGA. So as opposed to just being from the DOCG. And then Vigna, which is like a single vineyard, again, even more controlled after that. But Dogliani is really controlled. So you can only pick 7 per hectare of these grapes, as opposed to like 8.7 for other parts as well. So it makes a big difference. You're actually getting very like focused wines in the bottle.
But you get so much more concentration.
Exactly. And it was the traditional wine of the people. And it really was one of the first wines that was being made. And it's such a focal point of the culture that I do think everyone should be drinking it more. And it's not, I mean, it's very nice. I feel it's a very nice wine. I want people to drink it more, but then I also don't, because I don't really want the price to be driven up. And at the moment, it's at quite a nice price point. But more, the other wines that people should look out for are Barbera. I adore Barbera. Barbera is very easy drinking. It's a little bit meaty. It can be, will get the Barbera d'Asti and the Barbera di Alba, and they're very different. So Alba is a little bit more, you get more of that like, I guess it's that iron sort of ferrous content that's coming through, again, because there's like a lot of clay calcareous soils that are there, which bring out that sort of like meaty, bloody sort of element. But then it has this nice like rich red berries and, you know, a little bit of like herbs that are coming through. So it's a very elegant, good wine for food. It's got some nice tannin structure on it as well. So it's a nice hybrid between, say, Barolo and Dolcetto. But then Barbera d'Asti, I think those are exquisite wines. In Asti and the Ruera in general, so as opposed to sort of like Alba where there's more clay soils, there's more sand in Ruera. And that gives this beautiful finesse and this lightness that comes through, and this elegance. Very dangerous winemaking area. So again, lots of hills, but because of sand, if you think of sand, it's like people just fall. And there's a lot of farmers that die just on these slopes every year, because it's just get a lot of slides. It's very slippery, and they just fall away and crumble. So, but makes beautiful wine. So I would say everyone should seek out Barbera d'Asti. I think it's such a fantastic grape. And banging prices most of the time. We're talking about like £15 and you can get an outstanding Barbera d'Asti.
I was drinking a Barbera actually on Thursday night, and I couldn't tell you where it came from because I tried it blind. And what I thought was really interesting was when I was first sort of pressed to make a call on what I thought it was, I actually went for Syrah, which seems like a strange thing. I mean, I was thinking more of a kind of south of France, a bit, warmer climate Syrah, because there was some red fruit, there was some dark fruit, but there was a really intense kind of herbal nature to it as well, which was what drew me towards the Syrah grape. A little bit of pepperiness, a little bit of garigi, kind of rosemary kind of notes. Yeah.
And it gets sometimes like some mentholy elements as well. And I find them more in the Alba styles. So I find that you can start to get that, what I like to just call that, I'm like, this is like Amaro, because it's got all those like aromatic compounds, but also this menthol, but bittery sort of component that's coming through. So yeah, that herbal element, it's very interesting. So yeah, I think more people should drink that. But one of the grapes that I think everyone should seek out if they can, and we're starting to see a couple of bottles over here, not many. This is one you have to go into sort of like a geeky wine shop and ask for, but it's Pella Verga. So it is from Verdugno, which is one of the villages in Barolo. So which you saw, it was that top part. So it's very like, it's got a lot of finesse on it. But Pella Verga is, again, an indigenous sort of varietal to the region, but it is so spicy. It's fun. It's very good with food, but you get this distinctive, so it's very red fruits. It then gets this distinctive like white and green pepper note, like white and green peppercorns. So it kind of tastes like arugula. So that's sort of like whenever you see that sort of flavor coming in, you're like, oh my goodness, it's this Pella Verga. So it's a cool thing. And you'll see it under Verdugno DOC. So that's one of its appellations, which it's sort of grown under, which you also can grow Barolo from that area. So that's a bit confusing. But yeah, it's definitely one to seek out.
So basically just a case of we've all got to go out there and just immerse ourselves in this region as much as we possibly can.
I want everyone to obviously drink Barolo too, but I feel like Barolo's the least thing. Barolo's for like you're busting out for a fancy dinner 10 years down the line. If you're wanting wines to drink now, then honestly, just start reaching for some. Get your Dolcettos for a midweek bit of fun. Barberas for some really interesting ones. Barbarescos for an extreme celebration where you want something elegant and opulent, and then white grapes. We haven't even spoken much about, Arnaise is such a pretty grape. It's just so floral. It gets this, I like to describe it as like a white blueberry element and even like a pink lady apple that comes through. It's very, very pretty. And I find it's a white wine to show people who don't even like white wine because it's got so much flavor in it that it's not, it's crisp, it's got really good structure on it, but it's just so pretty. And that's the only way I can describe it. And then your Nasetta, which is interesting because you get some really different sort of oily notes that are coming through in that. And obviously you can have your Moscatos if you like something a bit sweeter. Another style of wine that people don't often speak about over here is Brachetto, which is a sweeter red wine. So it's kind of like Moscato's version, but as a sweet red. So again, really good for, just an afternoon tea or just popping with some friends. I find Brachetto goes really nicely with very drying salty cheeses. And yeah, so that's pretty much it from like the styles of wine. But there is also a unique vermouth style wine here as well, which is Barolo Chinotto, which is very cool to try. It's an aromatized wine, so like your vermouth, and it's made with sort of like the bark of the Barolo. So they use the Barolo and then they mix it with like some bitter combo. I don't really know how this is made, but it is very tasty. And yeah, we don't get many over here, but you can get one every now and then. And they're all different depending on where they're from again. So it's sort of like, just try it. If you like it, you'll get some different flavors.
Do you know what? I've never had a Barolo Chinotto and I'm so excited to try one. We do have one at the Oxford Wine Company and we did have a bottle open, but unfortunately I was off that day and none of my colleagues left me a bit because it was just too delicious.
It's so delicious.
So I suppose I'm just going to have to shell out really and try some. Just before we sort of move on, because I really want to talk about food as well, I did want to circle back and talk a little bit about Moscato d'Asti because it is a real guilty pleasure of mine. It's something that I just love to try, love to drink, and something that's becoming really, really popular now, I think. And then a few more producers making their way over to the UK as well. Yeah. Is this something that you sort of drink quite a lot of yourself, or?
Yes, Moscato is utterly delicious. It's just like fizzy water or like soft drink for adults, but much more prized than that. So it was the method for making sparkling wine in this way was patented in the region. So that's where it comes from. So whenever people have done that, shot and stopped fermentation, that comes from Moscato d'Asti. So that is what pioneered it way, way back in the 1800s. So it was a long, long time ago that we've had Moscato. And it's normally very low alcohol because of this, premature fermentation. So it's about 5.5%. So it's really easy. It normally has a good amount of sugar on it. It's not a huge amount of sugar. It's not overly cloying. It's just a nice, refreshing sort of drink. In Italy, they'll have it a lot with your Parma hams. So that's normally what you'll often see with Moscato. You'll sit down with the producer, you'll have a Moscato d'Asti, often finishing a wine tasting, bizarrely now. I've been noticing I'll be with producers and they'll be like, we'll finish our wine tasting, and now shall we have a glass of Moscato d'Asti and some ham and melon? I'm like, that sounds like a nice civilized way to finish up. But yeah, so they drink it quite readily. In France, it does incredibly well. So in Paris, there's a real appetite for Moscato, particularly Moscato d'Asti. And so we're seeing more of that. It also was beloved in Russia. That's become a bit problematic in the past few years. So we've been seeing a number of winemakers turning to what are they doing with their Moscato that's being planted, because back with the whole issues with the Ukraine and with Russia, and particularly last year, Italy just stopped ties, and so they stopped selling there. So this meant that they lost a huge amount of sales and a huge amount of where Moscato was going. So now it's being pushed into other markets, which is great news for all of us. But that's sort of why we're starting to see it more over here, because they'd lost a huge client in the market. What I like about Moscato as well is now we're seeing more producers making still Moscato, which you're getting that nice like peachy flavor that comes through, and this beautiful sort of like stony fruit. Like I like how it has this nice apricot-y quality to it, which kind of makes sense when you think of what's growing nearby, because there's a lot of peaches. I mean, the region's very, very famous for its peaches, particularly like they've even got a naked peach which has no fur on it. So that's quite interesting. They've got beautiful apricots as well. So again, everything sort of takes and comes together, and that's what you get in Moscato. So yes, I drink it quite a lot. I like that more people are drinking it, and I think it's a very nice afternoon wine, and I think that's where it has a great place. But also, if people are having a Bellini, why not have a Moscato for breakfast?
Absolutely. We have to do it. It would be sacrilege not to. Let's talk about food, and let's talk about some of the key dishes that we haven't already mentioned, and a couple of different pairings.
Yeah, so I would say, so obviously we've got the White Truffle. So we've got the White Truffle Festival that happens every year. It's a bit chaotic. I'm not going to say it's not. It's a very, very busy time. Alba is a very small town. It really shouldn't be in flux with this many people for the Festival of the Truffle, but it manages to do okay, similar to Edinburgh at Fringe time, I suppose. So the White Truffle is very, very key. And for that, you're looking at Barbarescos and Barolos. That is the perfect style. So if you're wanting to bring out the elegance, shave a bit of white truffle on top of maybe like, some veal, that's like a beautiful dish there. Or their very famous beef and lambs. So meat is your best friend when you're looking at Barolos and Barbarescos. So we're thinking meat, we're thinking polentas, so like your really nice stewed polenta with some beef on top. Some of my favorite dishes in the world have been just slow cooked beef, polenta, and then a nice glass of Barolo. But when you're moving back into other ones, then obviously they have really nice. They do a lot of raw meat there, so it's like the Piemonte's carne di crudo. So it's sort of like your beef tartare, and that is really lovely alongside your Langhe Nebbiolos. Really nice with some Barbera d'Asti, and then Barbera d'Alba I find is perfect for spaghettis, pastas, a bit more with like your tomato-y bases as well. One of my cool combos that I discovered this year was with that Pella Verga, so from the Junior DOC. That is really nice alongside chicken. I think because it's like that spicy white and green peppery note, that one's very good with a roast chicken. So I tend to bust that out quite regularly when I can, if I can find a particular bottle of it. And there's a really nice one done by Roberto Verrazio, which is a famous producer in the region, and he makes quite a nice one. And what else? Then they've got Nutella, obviously. So in 20th of April, 1964, I think that was it. That was when the first Nutella jar was created. So we've got Mr. Ferrero's whole I don't know what you even call it, not machine, factory is in Alba. So it's right in the town of Alba. And he has about 7 gardens, which are absolutely exquisite. But everyone loves Mr. Ferrero because everyone's quite affiliated and it does a lot of work for the town. So it's really, really helpful in sort of moving money into the actual region. And that's obviously the famous hazelnuts. You go at a certain time, you smell the hazelnuts everywhere. It's absolutely glorious to smell the hazelnuts as you're standing at the top of the hills, and all these lovely scents are wafting up. And I actually just quite like eating the hazelnuts alongside different wines when you're drinking them. So a nice little snack. Salted is really good alongside like your classic Nebbiolos. And then we're talking about if you can do them a little sweeter or just plain, very nice alongside your Moscato d'Asti. Very nice alongside Arnaise as well, actually. And then they're very famous for their peaches and some apricots. And yeah, they're just very good with food. They make a lot of veal with like your tuna tonino. So it's like a tuna mayonnaise on top. So that's a very famous dish there, which goes very well with just your classic Nebbiolos, your classic Barbares. And as we've both touched on, Dolcetto, it's your pizza wine.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a subject that you could just talk about for days and days and days, which is, of course, why it's such a magical region and why we should all visit it, quite frankly, to be honest. I mean, in terms of heading down there, if anyone's interested in visiting the region from the UK, what's the best way to go about it? I thought it was quite cool. You can actually take the train down. You can take the Eurostar to Paris, and then there's a train that goes from Paris through Lyon and then over into Turin. But what sort of recommendations would you make for people interested in visiting the region?
Yeah, so that one's really easy to do, particularly if you don't like flying. But I normally do one of 2 ways. So I'll either fly into Turin, which is very easy to fly into, big major airport. You can then get a train directly so there's a very quick train from Turin to the city. And then the train station there is fantastic. If you want to go to Asti or Alba, there's 2 different stations and 2 different trains that run to each. It takes about an hour, costs about €5. So it's for a return trip, so it's hardly pricey. It's a lovely day trip, but I would recommend staying overnight. It's very nice to wake up in that beautiful town. It's a nice spot to visit. So yeah, that's very easy from there. Or you can also fly into Milan. So either both of Milan airports, so Bergamo and Malpensa. I never know how to pronounce that because I never fly into that one. I always fly into Bergamo. So you can then catch the train from there to Turin, which is from Bergamo. It's about an hour from there to Turin, and then you can get the train to Alba or Asti from there. So again, really, really easy, very accessible. Most places in the UK fly to at least Turin or Milan. So, it's not a far way to go. It's only 50 kilometers drive from Turin airport to Alba. So that's also very easy. So you're talking about 45 minutes. You can pick up a car at the airport, drive there. It's a beautiful drive. And if you're there, it's quite nice to have a car because then you can go around all the different little villages and they are very pretty. Like having spent some time in Verduno earlier this year, I really rate that town. That's a very nice little town. But you do need a car to get between places because, it's hilly, as we've discussed. There's a lot of hills. You can't really walk these hills and it's far. So it's a big sort of area as well. So you need to hop around. But if you're just wanting to go centrally, there's lots of vineyards near Alba. So you can obviously do that very easily from there as well. Particularly you could go and visit Pio Cesari, who's a very famous producer that has their actual winery just in Alba. So that is accessible by foot if you arrive in town. So you just need to book that one.
That's wonderful. Well, any final thoughts, anything to say to our listeners about the region?
Reach out to me. If anyone wants any tips, then I'm always open to, having somebody reach out to me and we can put my email in a show note. But yeah, I love talking about it. It's a beautiful place to visit. I would encourage everyone to go there. You really get an understanding for the region once you're there. And particularly if you can go during, not that it's the most desirable month, but when I was there in January, I got a real understanding of the winds and the river and how everything tied in together. Because if you were in one spot in a village and then moved, a 10-minute drive, the winds would change massively. You'd have like Arctic winds in one spot and then not in the other. So it's nice to compare the two. And it's good to see the Tonaro and how it sort of divides everything.
Isobel, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate everything. And I can't wait until we do the next one and we can go even geekier into soils and landscapes and everything like
Oh,
that. Thank you
me
so
too.
much.
We can do producers as well. So that seems like a very good one for part two. But yeah, as I said, this has been wonderful, good fun. I hope I haven't chatted on too much and spoken to endless nonsense. I tend to get quite passionate about this region.
No, as do I, as do I. So no, it's absolutely fantastic. Isabel, thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take
Cool. All
care.
right, see you later. Bye.